primeiro. Vai mostrar o peitinho pra mim, empina esse rabetão. Ela já tá louca. Vai achar que é sentar em mim, eu nunca vou ser.
Hello critters, welcome back to my channel. You're looking good today. Here we deconstruct religion and reconstruct something beautiful in its place. After my latest video, we got some new subscribers. Yay, welcome. But I realized you guys don't really know my story and you don't know why I can't shut the fuck up about philosophy, religion, deconstruction, and why I'm so high in neuroticism and just like this in general. So today I'm going to tell you my story of religious trauma. It's kind of a roller coaster. It involves gun violence, child abuse, almost becoming a cult leader's bride, a Disney movie saving my life, and a maddening spiral into nihilism, and so much more. So I think it's worth listening to, and I think there's a lot to be learned from it. So today I'm going to tell you my story of religious trauma. I will try to make it insightful and educational as we go through. I'm going to try to teach some concepts about deconstruction, religious trauma, cults, atheistic spirituality, and more. Hello, really quickly before we get too far into it, I just want to say this week Donald Trump mobilized the military against Americans exercising their First Amendment rights, and a senator was tackled to the ground and arrested for asking questions during a hearing. This Saturday, June 14th, there's something called the No Kings March. We are protesting to say, hey, we don't do kings here in America, right? That's the whole point. That's why we started this fucking thing. The point of it being to drown out any coverage of his stupid, shitty little military parade, that narcissistic. Go to the website, No Kings March, and find one near you, and let's get out there Saturday. Okay, thanks, bye. So, my rocky relationship with religion begins in the most American way possible, a mass shooting. My mom had me stay at a daycare, as one does when you have a kid and have a job, and it happens an absurd amount in the South. Like, seriously, guys, it happens all the time. I've heard about it like twice this year just in my area. Someone showed up to the daycare to shoot their wife. And of course, who was his wife holding? Me, bitch. A gunfight broke out. Some cops were shot. He then shot himself. Obviously traumatized by having a mass shooting at your child's daycare, my mom turned to her local community and trusted the word of those around her. And the new babysitters that were recommended to her were a preacher and his wife. A couple of Baptists. Because Baptists have always treated children great. Big shock. I've had to do so much trauma therapy for this period of my life. This environment was physically and emotionally abusive every day. I was like 4 to 6 years old at the time. They would hit us with wooden spoons as punishment, a tactic I would later find out comes directly from James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, that organization that's pro-conversion therapy, pro-forced birth, anti-public education, etc., all the horrible things. He wrote a book called The Strong-Willed Child, where he literally advocating for beating children with spoons. I literally figured this out because of that documentary that came out about the Duggars, and they talked about their methods of beating their kids, where they would put them on a blanket, and if they tried to crawl off of it, they would hit them. Fuck you, James Dobson. I can't wait to see you in hell. I'm counting down the days, and then I'll beat your ass when I get there. So it was just like normal, regular, everyday activities. She would also have us watch extremely graphic and bloody reenactments of the crucifixion, like a totally normal, sane thing to show a child. I'm talking like more gruesome than the Passion of the Christ. Like, it was so gruesome that the kid who was staying there with me would puke. And while we were watching this, she would teach us stuff like, we didn't deserve that Jesus did this for us. A totally normal, insane thing to tell literal children. Everything in that house was so shame heavy, because it's what their entire belief system was built off of. Every little thing we did that was normal for kids to do, like eating, talking, bickering, playing too loud, was shamed. Which again, directly inspired by evangelical Christianity and people like James Dobson. And who's that other guy? Yes, Bill Gothard. People like him. They would force us to run laps outside as a punishment. And they would also have us do free labor for the church. Cleaning it, hauling stuff, like whatever like a 5-6-year-old was able to do. But I do remember it still being really hard. And interesting tidbit, cult scholars Daniela Young and Margaret Singer talk about how a key aspect of cults is that they always try to exploit your labor and get it for free. Just an interesting tidbit as we're talking about this Baptist family. Shame is incredibly harmful to everyone. Like, shame teaches you that you are bad, not that you did something bad. And their religion taught them that all humans, including us little kids, are bad. Shame is especially harmful for small children while they're developing their sense of self and attachment to others. Children raised in shame-based systems are much more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, risky behaviors, destructive behaviors, eating disorders, and more. Thanks, guys, for setting me up for success from the start. In order for people to individuate and become fully integrated people, we have to look at and accept the parts of ourselves that we don't like or are ashamed of. The shame stops you from doing that, though. That's why Carl Jung described shame as soul-eating emotion and said that it was incompatible with healthy, full individuals. And a lot of people don't like to accept this, but Christianity, a lot of the sects of Christianity, are shame-based. Like, it's a shame-based religion. Because shame, again, is when you believe I am bad, and guilt is when you believe I did something bad. Guilt can be healthy. Shame is never, ever healthy. That's literally what the original sin teaching is. We're taught that we're all sinners. It's inherent in our nature after the fall. It's inside of us that humans are unworthy of God's forgiveness that He gives us anyways. That is instilling things about your self-worth and value. It's not just, oh, humans did a bad thing once. It goes way beyond that. And the kid that was staying there with me, he behaved super dysfunctionally and would do pretty much everything he could to, like, bully me. So I not only had that coming from the babysitter, but also the kid staying there with me. But I don't really blame him anymore because, like, with all that shame and, like, physical abuse, of course his behaviors were coming out dysfunctionally. Like, that makes total sense. There's no data that hitting kids does anything except make them dysfunctional in different ways. And a key detail here is this was setting me up for the future, like abuse in the future. Studies show that kids that are abused in early childhood are much more likely to accept abuse into adulthood. When it's just the water you swim in, it's harder for you to recognize it or push against it in the future. And while I think at 4 to 6 years old, I couldn't fully even conceptualize what they were talking about with a God or Jesus clearly, because I was so young, I still internalized all that negativity, like, and took it very seriously. My nervous system was doing that to keep me safe. With all this physical and emotional abuse going on, this is why I have a really hard time with Christians now when they say things like, oh, God protected me from this thing, God keeps me out of the trenches, like that one girl on YouTube Shorts or whatever said, or God is always blessing me. Because I can't help but wonder what 4 to 6 year old me did that made me unworthy of getting help from God, or why He chose not to protect me. It's just when I hear it, I'm like, oh, good for you. I wonder what she did to not get to have that. And this environment is where I learned to constantly monitor and read the room to survive because she was so explosive and quick to punish. It's where I learned to shrink and disappear and to go unnoticed to survive because that's what she wanted me to do, is to be meek and shut up and obey and submit. And it's where I learned to people please to survive. And those lessons were reinforced throughout the rest of my life as a Christian. It's when I was separated from my own inner wisdom and sense of self and rejected her because of shame, and it kicked off my journey of trying to be good in the eyes of this patriarchal religion of Christianity. So that was my childhood, and I continued to be raised in strict Southern Baptist culture, and we would go to church sometimes. But the culture of that Baptist religion permeated every aspect of my life, to the point where it was like all of my conversations with friends and family had undertones of Christianity. The education system, despite the supposed separation of church and state, was still influenced by religion in the South. That shame and guilt framework was present in everybody's mind, and it was the only way people here know how to function. Like, when I tell you that my hometown was like 99% Christian, I don't think that's an exaggeration. I grew up in a hometown of something like 5,000 people, and they were all Christian. Everywhere you go, it was just the default, and the thought of it being anything else was just like out of this world, not like fiction. The perception of atheists in that town was just like they're all just heathens, like demons, like just the worst people. Like, they dehumanize them so badly. And even if you didn't say it verbatim, like, that was the belief you had in your head, that they were like degenerates, that they were all just angry. And growing up, I couldn't recognize it at the time, but now when I look back, it's so clear that this Christian Baptist framework was unhealthy for all of them. There is so much generational trauma in that hometown that religion maybe psychologically helped them cope through, but gave them no tools to build any sort of healthier life, and they just continued to pass down this damage to their kids. of not being able to regulate your emotions and believing that shame is the answer to everything. If you did something wrong in my hometown, the entire town would publicly start talking about you because everybody knew everybody, and they got you in line by public shame of gossip. Like, it's the craziest thing. So I started going to church more regularly in high school and got super intensely religious then too, because my best friend pressured me to go to church camp with her. And turns out, if you're a vulnerable, emotionally immature, traumatized teenager and you go to a church camp where they rile you up and make you feel like shit and make you cry, you get super into the religion thing. And as a normal teenage girl, I started to become interested in boys and girls, but I wasn't ready to accept that yet at that time. Something that is completely developmentally appropriate, but within purity culture, and let me tell you, the purity culture was so intense, but within purity culture, that interest is viewed as sinful. So I had these totally normal feelings because I'm a human with a body, and my family reacted by treating me like the village whore. Like, stone the witch, throw her in a lake and make her drown. Like, I cannot believe she wants a boyfriend and has a libido. The extent of their actions to shame me was so extreme that my therapist, who specializes in religious trauma, was stunned. So I carried that intense shame, and it was compounded by my traumatic experiences. Like, some of the things they did, guys, I don't want to get into it because it's so bad and, like, obviously kind of private, but my family made me feel like worse than chewed up gum, to use in evangelical language. At the same time as that was happening, I did have the boyfriends who were constantly pushing themselves on me. And that's what happens in purity culture, because women are treated as the gatekeepers of purity, while men are taught that they're out of control and their sexual desires are like animalistic. Both narratives are harmful to both people. So I experienced this cognitive dissonance where I was being burdened and shamed by all the authority figures, teachers included, for simply having desires or having a boyfriend, while the boys who I was dating were pushing themselves on me and pushing boundaries and faced no consequences or shame. And because purity culture causes people, this is just Jungian psychology, what you suppress in yourself will drive you and take control and cause it, and it'll come out dysfunctionally. So those boys that I was dating began to sexually abuse me. But I didn't even know that's what was happening at the time, because purity culture is so obsessed with stigmatizing sex that it never teaches what a healthy relationship looks like or what consent is. No one once explained that to me. If you asked me back then to define consent in a sexual context, I could not have done it. So I was constantly all the time feeling anxious, sick, miserable, but I didn't know why. It's because my autonomy was being taken away. I was being violated. But I thought that horrible feeling just was because I was sinning. And that's the sort of shame cycle that purity culture keeps you in. They teach you that something is bad, so you should feel shame and bad about it. And then when you do it, because you're a human and you're an organism that has a sex drive, you will inevitably feel those feelings. And then feeling them makes you feel bad, and then they look at it and go, see, you feel bad, told you it was a sin, it feels bad, right? And at this time, while I was the one being hurt, the authority figures in my life were shaming me because I was the woman. I remember reading, and almost any therapist will tell you this, sometimes the more traumatizing thing is not the thing that happens itself, it's the authority figures in your life reactions to that thing. And everybody in my life, from parents to more distant family members to teachers, were shaming the hell out of me. In the book When Religion Hurts You, the author explains how everybody's body and nervous system codes trauma differently. Some people find certain teachings deeply traumatic, while others don't. To quote from that book, these researchers found that trauma is subjective, perceptive, and a physiological response to a person, place, or thing that overwhelms the nervous system's natural capacity to cope. Practically, this means that trauma is in the eye of the beholder. What is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another, and the body may experience trauma as a result of either a real threat or a perceived one. So just perceived threats can also be traumatic. For example, hell teachings. For some reason, were not very traumatic for me. I don't know why. Maybe my nervous system never registered it as a realistic threat. When I deconstructed, my belief in hell was one of the first things that fell away super easily. But for others, and I'm sure some of you, hell is a source of deep trauma, and it makes total sense. I mean, it's a terrifying concept where every action you do or don't do contributes to the possibility of eternal suffering. I would definitely count that as a threat, a perceived threat to your well-being. The same goes for purity culture. Some people can bounce back quickly. That was not the case for me. I think due to early childhood experiences, my nervous system is just super sensitive to shame. So culture was profoundly traumatic for me. And I've realized in therapy that the reason for that is because it threatened my goodness, the thing I needed to prove to survive. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Our nervous systems evolved for millions of years to care deeply about being accepted by our group. Being cast out meant death because we were not the fastest, we were not the strongest. I mean, look at us. So shame is a super powerful tool that is wielded by abusive people and organizations. And my body reacts really strongly to it. So purity shame was super harmful for me. But it's important to remember that everyone's trauma is different. So if something was traumatic for you and you're confused as to why the others around you don't seem to be affected by it, that is so valid. Trauma is not a one-size-fits-all, and everybody's nervous system codes it differently. But regardless, I continued to go to church every service, read my Bible, pray, do all the things to prove that I was good and to try to have a good relationship with God. Religion did offer me like a safety blanket for a lot of really hard things that I don't know how well I could have coped with as a teenager who was given no other tools. Like, it was good enough at the time. Like in Buddhism, there's this parable of the raft where you build a raft, you get across the river, and then once you get across the river, you don't just carry the raft around forever, you leave it. But some people will look back at the raft and be like, oh, that was so stupid that I needed that raft. But it served you at the time. So I can understand there was psychological needs that were being met by religion. But with purity culture and some of the other teachings, it was doing so much more damage than it was doing me good. For example, due to that childhood abuse and my current ongoing abuse from my boyfriends at the time, and growing up with emotionally immature parents, I was an extremely anxious person. Can't imagine why. But the only help for that anxiety that I ever got within this framework was what the Bible says about anxiety: pray and give it to God. That's it. And this is a good moment to teach you about a concept called spiritual bypassing, where you use religious or spiritual teachings to bypass hard things instead of facing them. So instead of learning to process my anxiety through my body with healthy skills in a way that makes biological sense, I was taught to just bypass them. Just pray, give it to God, don't worry. So big shocker, with that advice, my anxiety just stayed around. There was also the anxiety of moralizing everything, because everything is, are you going to go to heaven or hell? For example, having to worry about everybody's eternal fate around you, because we were taught that, like, even people who'd never heard the word or had someone to try to make them a Christian or help them understand God would still go to hell forever. That's a lot for a teenager to carry. Also, and this is pretty universal, I believe, there's this very widespread teaching in Christianity that all your worth and validation should only come from God. And anytime your worth or validation is from an external source, it can be hurt and it is volatile. You're never going to be fully fulfilled or happy that way. Yes, that includes God, not just getting external validation from other people. God is still an external thing. Humans really need to be healthy, our self-worth and validation to come internally. If it's within you, it can't be hurt. But I was only ever taught an external source of validation, so no wonder I grew up wildly insecure and stayed that way until I fully left religion. And now I don't really have insecurities anymore. It never bothers me. I also had times where, obviously, my boyfriends, I say boyfriends plural because it was like I dated different people throughout high school, so I just realized that sounds odd. But there was one boyfriend in particular who was pretty emotionally abusive. So I went to my Sunday school teacher and was like, hey, what do I do? And she pretty much told me to pray for him, stay with him, work through it. Because in this culture, you get married super young. So while I was only a teenager in high school, they saw him as a very likely candidate for me to marry one day. And telling a teenager to stay in an abusive relationship because it could be ordained by God, insane. But that's like the norm here in this evangelical Baptist culture, because Even my mom, who was in an emotionally abusive marriage, was pressured by the church community to stay in that marriage for so long until she couldn't take it anymore. And we'll talk about that more later. But she could have ended so much suffering if she had just had the autonomy to decide her relationship. And what's really heartbreaking about this time in my life is I look back and I see a teenager who tried so hard to be good in their eyes and in God's eyes, and was almost always hurt by this system instead of helped. Looking back, I did so much for the church, like volunteered, did leadership. I loved God so much in the church and I followed its teachings. I did everything a good Christian should do by praying all the time, evangelizing, going to every service possible, studying the Bible outside of service. While that system again gave me some flawed safety blankets on certain topics, that system mostly just hurt me in return. But this is also why it's a little funny when I get to the "you're never a real Christian" comments, because if I did all of that and was not a real Christian, that's on God. That's his fault, not mine. I held up my end of the deal. That would be the worst trade deal in the history of trade deals. Younger me was really trying her best for God, and the thought of her only repeatedly being hurt like she was is very sad. So then, as I became like a slightly older teenager, but still clearly a teenager at 17, there was a 26-year-old, it just keeps going, you guys, a 26-year-old groomed me using religious teachings. So the concept of how you should only be with one person forever, he used that to manipulate me to be with him, because having sex with others, like, creates soul ties, and you'll have soul ties to all these people, and I'm mature and can take care of you, I'm a godly man, I'm really Christian. And so I was groomed into yet another abusive relationship with someone who was 26 while I was 17. This system hides abusers, just like inherently in its teachings. Because anything that comes to their mind, like, oh, I'm supposed to be with this 17-year-old, they can infuse with the authority of God and say that it's the right thing. And if they do anything wrong, they can just say, oh, I'm forgiven. It's okay. So yeah, those years were rough. But then we transitioned into the college years. And as I entered college, I began learning how to think critically, because, like, my high school education didn't really teach that. I started to finally have major issues with the church. And one of the things I noticed is how women were treated. It never made sense to me or sat right with me. Why would God design this system where I am a second-class citizen? Like, women were not allowed to be leaders in the church. And there was one Mother's Day where they talked about the spiritual role of women. Not one woman spoke that day. Not about her experiences, not like at all, not one woman, because they weren't allowed to. But you know what they did do? They handed out pamphlets saying that women's role in the world was to keep a clean house, to take care of kids, to be a homemaker. And if that started to slip, if the house started to get messy, she was failing spiritually. And that's what the whole lesson was about. And, like, one, how does that make infertile women feel if they can't have kids? But also, no one can afford a single income house, like, right now, and they couldn't then. So women were just expected to work two jobs because they had to work the home job, which is being the one who takes care of the kids, cleans the house, cooks the meals, and also have a job to bring in income. So it's kind of just like expected for women to work two jobs, while men did not have that expectation. And we had a huge Sunday school class in my high school girls class, and all of a sudden there was a huge drop off in attendance for women once we got to the college age class, because it was boys and girls. And I quickly found out why. Because I was treated like I did not exist. I wasn't allowed to answer any questions, and only the men taught. And when they would go around the room and ask everybody how they're doing, when they got to the men, it would be like, how's college? How's your career? And when they got to me, they would just be a general, how are you? And I was getting a STEM degree at the time, so you bet your ass I was like, and school's good too, thanks. And there were so many small other things, like, just, they were never allowed to speak, and they were never acknowledged. I would go to church with my boyfriend, and the preacher would shake his hand every Sunday and be like, I just appreciate you coming to church, even though you have a job, and I know that must be hard. Mind you, I had a job at the time too, but whatever. And then every week he would look at me and just be like, what's your name again? Okay, thanks. And again, there was like the expectations for women to stay in abusive marriages. And it just, there were so many things with how they treated women that I just thought was so wrong. I was also studying genetics at the time, And every church I went to, and I tried different ones, denied evolution. And even now, as an atheist, I believe science and religion can coexist. That's fine. But how am I supposed to trust these church leaders with my theology and spiritual truths when they completely reject basic scientific things like evolution? Like, I remember there was one sermon where the pastor was like, if I had a phone and I took it apart and I leave it in a parking lot for 1,000 years, it doesn't become a phone again. And that's the dumbest, like, dumb ass analogy for evolution that I have ever heard, just like on every level. This is the straw man of straw mans. We are skipping down the yellow brick road, dropping piles of straw behind us because we're the scarecrow kind of straw man. I also had issues with the church's rampant homophobia. I grew up with queer friends, like the few queer people that were in my town. Thank goodness, because that meant a lot to me and benefited my development a lot. I loved them so much. I couldn't recognize it at the time, but they were also a safe space for me because I was bisexual and I didn't face that shame from them all the time. I just didn't understand why God would care. Like, he created the universe. Look at the pictures that the James Webb Telescope has captured, and then tell me that God cares if boys kiss boys. That is the most human, man-made, made-up shit I've ever heard. And also, this was 2015, 2016. I had become super disillusioned with the church for its almost unanimous support of Donald Trump. Like, I sincerely, even now as an atheist, call him the Antichrist because of how unaligned he is with the teachings of Christ. I cannot believe this is their guy. Now I can, it makes perfect sense. But at the time, I was blown away. I realized, like, seeing them rally behind his attacks on immigrants as a whole, like the racism that he encouraged towards them, and that's only one thing, but I just realized that this church did not contain the love that Jesus taught us to have for one another. It was not there. So, eventually I stopped going, and I decided that I'm gonna figure this shit out for myself. I even still have journals from that time filled with questions about trying to figure out if you can have science and religion, and is the Bible really that misogynistic? So I was in a vulnerable spiritual place. All I had ever known was Baptist teachings, and now I was questioning them, and they had offered me no alternative frameworks because my entire life that was the only one that existed around me. I felt completely lost. And then I decided to go to college in the big city, to move hours away and go to a larger university instead of the community college in my hometown. So I suddenly didn't have my family, my friends. I was an anxious kid in the middle of a faith crisis. My home life was unraveling as my parents were moving towards a divorce. And I was in a new place that I was not familiar with. And that's when I met who I thought was two college girls who were part of a Bible study and doing a survey for it. And I was super naive and believed that everybody had good intentions. So while I was a little annoyed about being stopped in front on my way to Portuguese class, I had not yet learned how to dodge people at the tables at college, like SpongeBob and Patrick going through the perfume department. So I said sure. And unfortunately for me, it was the perfect question to get me at the time. They asked me, do I believe Adam and Eve were the first human beings? I said no. They said, oh, are you a Christian? And I said, yeah. And they said, oh, how do you square that or explain that? And I was like, honestly, I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out. And they were like, oh, we have an explanation. Are you open to hearing it? Yeah, sure. And I really liked it. They were basically explaining, like, using Bible verses about how Adam and Eve weren't the first physical human beings, but the first spiritual human beings. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's fucking awesome. You can have both. And they were like, do you want to join our Bible study? And I was like, yeah, of course, that sounds fucking awesome. And I was telling everybody, like, I found a cool Bible study. I had no idea what was coming for me. That sweet summer child. So, that Bible study was actually something that JMS cult calls the 30 lessons, and it's a slow grooming process that takes place over about the course of a year to bring you into their cult. Some really important things I want you to know about cult recruitment is that no one joins a cult. You can't consent to joining a cult because the recruitment process is always manipulative, exploitative, and deceptive. No one joins a cult knowing it's a cult. They join an organization they think is going to help them. JMS approached me claiming to be a normal Christian Bible study, and then were giving me the frog and boiling water treatment, where their teachings were slowly drip-fed into the lessons along with manipulation. They did not approach me saying, oh, Jung is the Messiah. Another important thing I want you to know is that cults commonly recruit on college campuses because people are most vulnerable to them in transition phases in their life. And that is one of the biggest ones you go through in your life. And now that I understand and can recognize abuse and manipulation, I can see and point out exactly how the 30 lessons are each manipulating someone into the cult and what purpose they serve. So they start with like harmless parable interpretation. One, to build up their credit with you, and two, to set up the system where they can kind of interpret the Bible however they want using parables. So for weeks and months, you just hear innocent stuff like, oh, the Peter and the fish story isn't literally about fish. Here's the Bible proof that it's actually a parable for evangelizing. Isn't that cool? And you're like, oh yeah, that's awesome. And then, they're becoming friends with you. And then they get into some of the lessons that start to be a little more manipulative and controlling. So, for example, they teach a lesson about Noah's flood, and the most important part of the lesson is how God used the flood to separate the good people and the bad people so the badness didn't spread to the good people, and it had to be done. So in the same way, you should cut unhealthy people out of your life. Later, when you're actually in the church, JMS defines that as anyone outside of JMS, but they don't tell you that extreme up front. There's also lessons like Elijah and the ravens, where like the ravens were actually people doing idol worship, and idols can be anything, so you should not do idol worship because God hates idol worship, and that could be hobbies that you're putting before God, friends that you're putting before God. And then later when you're in the church, JMS uses that to be like, yeah, it's almost everything. You should do nothing outside of JMS. There's also like a lesson about cults, and they're like, oh, obviously here you can see that they said Jesus was a cult and you don't think that. So then you're thinking like, oh, just because someone's teachings are a little different doesn't mean that they're a cult. In the same way that I wouldn't think Jesus was a cult. And again, once they've built that trust with you and start to convince you of things, they start slowly weaving in the more unorthodox doctrine, like that the Holy Spirit is actually a feminine spirit. But this really made me happy as someone who felt like women were unappreciated in the church, because they presented, aren't we so feminist? Look at this, there is a female God. And lessons like the original sin was actually Adam and Eve having sex, and that sex was the sin that broke God's heart. And that would be later used once you're into church to control who you love, marry, and have sex with, which is a huge control tactic for cults. And as they were doing this, they never told me the cult leader's name, and that was on purpose so I couldn't look him up. If I could have, the next 4 years would have been quite different. They just tell you like, oh, in Korea they address elders by their titles because that's a respectful thing to do, so we call him Sunsanim. And he's just some guy who made this Bible study. And here's a bunch of great stories about him as we're learning these. And this is taking advantage of a psychological phenomenon in humans called the halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where a positive first impression in one area of a person leads to automatically assuming that there are positive things about them in other unrelated areas. And as they were teaching me these lessons, they were love bombing the hell out of me and were becoming really close friends with me. Later I learned that this was a tactic they use called management, where they keep close tabs on how you're doing spiritually, quote unquote, and try to take up as much of your time as possible and really make you feel close to them and accepted by them so then they could bring you into the fold. But as someone who was never emotionally heard by their parents and had rejection-sensitive dysphoria due to growing up with ADHD, I was desperate for this validation. So I loved it. And it really worked. They got super close to you, made you feel appreciated and special, and like they wanted to be your friends, and I just ate it up. So my routine at the time was basically like, try to survive my classes, go to Bible study like once a week and learn a new lesson, and then hang out with them outside of the Bible studies and feel super appreciated and special, and like I had really good friends. So after 9 months to a year of this, and them slowly tightening the grip, they finally drop the bomb that Jung is their messiah, and they prove it, or try to prove it, with this insane numerology lesson. This is a good time to teach you something that's like an inoculation against cults, a fallacy called the Gish-Gallop fallacy, where it's this rhetorical technique where someone overwhelms their opponent in a debate by presenting a large number of arguments without caring if they're right or not, at a rapid pace, so it's too difficult for the opponent to refute them in real time. So, in this lesson, they basically throw a bunch of numerology numbers at you to point to Jung as the Messiah, but you're not fucking Dan McClellan, you're a random college student. And if you accept their conclusion on that lesson, then they'll bring you into the church. But at that point, you're like, they've been right about all of these other things so far. If I deny this guy now, there's a really good chance I go to hell. So now they've dropped that bomb on me that Jung is the Messiah. They've invited me to join their church services. I start going, and within the actual church itself, there's still an on-ramp for how crazy the teachings that there are. Again, it's just like another stage of frog in boiling water. So at first, the church love bombs the hell out of you. It makes you feel special. It gives you gifts. You're in a honeymoon phase. Like, you made it to God's history. Congratulations. You finally won religion. And because you're here now, you can meet the Messiah and you can rapture spiritually and go to the highest level of heaven in the golden city. How lucky are you? And at first they're like, oh, you're a spiritual baby, so God's going to be more forgiving with you. So if you struggle to keep up, that's okay. You have a lot to learn. Just be happy. And that's why people, when they first join, have this glow and are so happy and excited because you're being love bombed. You have this new sense of purpose. They haven't really started beating you down yet. So at the time, it was me going to church services. Everyone's so excited to see me there. Like, they're all so kind to me. And I will say, just for perspective, if you've never been in a cult, most of the people in the cult are super sincere and are like good people. They're not all evil. Most of them don't know about the abuses going on with the cult leader himself and are just victims of manipulation too and have learned unhealthy habits from the cult. So I do think that these people were sincere. I think that they were just taught how to be manipulative without knowing that's what it was. So you're in this church, you're being loved, you're in the honeymoon phase. You're special because you're in God's history and God chose you from a long time ago. This is God's most important mission and now you're here. Woohoo. Basically, they believe that their leader is the second coming of Christ, and if you join the church, you are being elevated to the bride level of love while regular Christians are still stuck at the child level of love. And without all the indoctrination, sounds insane, right? If somebody met somebody as a kid and raised them and then married them, we would call that like very extreme forms of grooming. God, it's okay if God does it. It's so bizarre. But again, they made it seem really innocent, ensured that it was not sexual or whatever, and you have a year of indoctrination of them leading you to this conclusion, so they normalize it enough. So they believe if you become perfect enough and you meet the Messiah, then you become spiritually raptured and you get to live in the golden city of heaven when you die. So then the expectations start to ramp up. So they were like, oh, we've got an extra room in the church. You could live here. Because it was like, obviously, it was small enough where they didn't have a full church building yet. They had service in this really big house. And they're like, you could live here and live with us. Wouldn't that be awesome? And I was like, yeah, that would be awesome. I could live with my Christian friends. I could get to church services so easily. This is a great idea. Oh my gosh. That is one of the biggest control tactics ever, is like controlling your physical reality. Never move in with church members or like into a church building. I know you guys may think that's obvious, but when you're so innocent, I don't do that. So I moved into the church building. I'm living in the church building at this point. And that's when the never-ending rat race towards spiritual perfection comes, because they teach you like perfection level is like level 700 and everything you do is points for or against you rapturing. From like how healthy the food you're eating is can be plus or minus points, to watching a YouTube tutorial could be minus points because you're wasting time. They start teaching you like, oh, you shouldn't consume media because Satan's work through the media and like it can influence you. And they teach that the worst sin ever, the one that originally broke God's heart, is sex outside of a JMS ordained marriage. So even having sexual thoughts or masturbating considered a major sin. Even though it's normal human biology, they make it into something so intensely shameful, which again, when that's all you've known, you don't even realize how controlling it is. And it continues, that expectation, the tightening grip slowly continues until they're using every single cult tactic in the book. I mean, the JMS is such a classic case of a cult, because every cult I learn about, I'm like, oh, JMS did that, oh, JMS did that, oh, JMS did that. So there's no way I'll be able to get to all of them, but I'm still going to talk about them here because it's good to know. So they start expecting you to wake up and be at pre-dawn services, which the time moved, but it was somewhere from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. every morning. And when you're a college student trying to study and you have to stay up late to get your stuff done, it was horrific. Like, sleep deprivation is a cult tactic that all cults use because it is so effective and it cripples critical thinking. According to studies from New Mexico University, 4 hours of sleep a night for 6 days in a row has the same impairment as someone who is drunk. They expect you to be able to pray for hours at a time, and if you can't and something's wrong with you, they take up all of your time because you have hours of long services on Sundays, on Wednesdays, sometimes on Fridays. You have morning service every single day. You get extra services here and there. Church meetings, leadership meetings, you have to go evangelize so many hours a week, and they ramp it up the longer you stay. And they frame it as, oh, you're in God's ultimate history, so you can rest when you're in the golden city. This is so important. You have to do this now. But they're trying to fill every hour of your life and make you exhausted so you don't have the time or energy to think critically or to question them. You can't if you're just stuck in survival mode. So I'm in the church building, going to service every morning, attending all of the services, evangelizing, working to teach Bible studies myself, and all while getting a STEM degree. Editing me here, chiming in. I also forgot to include that I did go to Korea and met the cult leader a couple times. Just interesting. If you're interested in that story, let me know if you have any questions. It's too much to get into right now, but I did go and I went to the cult compound in Korea and I met him more than once. Crazy. And that's why they act 3.5 years is like this spiritual time where like it's make or break in JMS, and that's when you become like a full-fledged spiritual adult, and that's why a lot of people leave at that time. It is because that's about how long it takes to push someone's body to the point where they can't take it anymore. That's how long it takes for them to completely destroy someone. They also teach, that when bad things happen, it's your fault because you left God's domain of protection, and He's waking you up to sin. So me being so exhausted, I was getting into car accidents and then thinking it was my fault because I was sinning or whatever, because I still had a libido. Big shock. And they teach that if good things happen, it's God rewarding you. So it's this circular, unfalsifiable narrative. And unfalsifiable narratives are so important to be able to recognize. They also used a tactic called phobia indoctrination, where they literally ingrain into your nervous system that if you leave, you are in danger, so that you're too scared to leave. They would tell stories nonstop of how people who left were never happy again, or got cancer, or died in a horrible car accident. And as someone prone to anxiety, my nervous system latched onto that. They also used these thought-terminating cliches, which are these like quippy phrases that are like easy to remember that will stop critical thinking. And their most effective one, I think, was one where they would always say, until the end, or go until the end, which basically means regardless of doubts or challenges or how exhausted you are or whatever, you have to stay in Providence and run for Providence until you die. Sorry, I didn't mention before, Providence is what they call JMS because they needed to rebrand after everybody figured out they were a cult, so I use those interchangeably sometimes on accident. But you need to stay in JMS until you die because it is that important. It's God's history, one chance to make God's history. So, I'm going to all the services, ingesting all this indoctrination nonstop that is so mentally abusive, and telling you have to be perfect, you have to be perfect, you have to be perfect, and then when you're in long enough and you've proven yourself enough, you get 2 life options. You can either go to a speed dating ceremony where you marry someone you only know after 2 days, or you become what they called a faith star, which is like a spiritual bride to God. They claimed that was like being a nun, but it turns out it was like actually a way for Jung to have brides while he was quote unquote the body of God, and then he would assault them. So I had begun on the path of becoming a faith star because I really believed that it was so innocent. Thank goodness I left and that he went to prison, and thank the people that like stood up and took him to court, because now no one else will be hurt. But I was on that path, and now I know it's because of what I look like. I was just like a young, conventionally attractive blonde woman, which is something that he's into. They also use the system I briefly acknowledged before called the management system, where like they assign these super long-term members to really emotionally manipulate and control younger, newer members or people that they're trying to bring into the church. So there were these 2 women that were actually like 30 that were evangelizing and managing me. And then I learned way later that would become my job as I was evangelizing people, and they would literally keep track of people's like personal things on a spreadsheet for everyone to see, so they knew where their soft points were and how to manipulate them best. I'll even show you a screenshot of the fucking spreadsheet. It with the names blurred. It's fucked up. But I didn't know that spreadsheet was a thing until way later. But the goal of the manager is to report up the spiritual condition of the new people and to educate how to best manipulate them and to control and take up all their time and get really enmeshed with them so that they join the group. So around the 3 year and some mark, I was destroyed by this organization. I was trying to finish my STEM degree. This was the middle of COVID, pre-vaccine, and my parents were going through a super messy divorce where they kept insinuating they were going to kill themselves. And I was worried sick all the time and physically exhausted. I got to the point where I couldn't wake up for pre-dawn anymore, which makes total sense. You can only run on 2 or 3 hours of sleep for so long. I was so exhausted that I was like blacking out on the bus between classes. Like my body was absolutely failing. I developed an eating disorder because they had disconnected me from my body so severely with nonstop bombardment of teachings like the flesh is bad, you shouldn't give in to the flesh, and suppressing my normal sex drive that I couldn't recognize hunger anymore. And also because I was living in the church building, I would rather just stay in my room than be hounded all the time about what I'm doing. So I dropped to 100 pounds, which is insane for me. Again, like I mentioned before, I was getting into car accidents because I was so exhausted. I was so emotionally unstable. Like I was truly struggling to just function. And then things started to add up that would slowly, as the ex-Mormons would say, break my shelf. So I'll explain some of those that helped me leave the cult because it's interesting, but also I think it could be helpful for helping others in their deconstruction. So there were a couple moments where I heard the reality or saw the reality of what was happening within JMS before I fully knew what was happening, because you couldn't know about the abuse that Jung was doing to women because they taught you that if you looked up like slander online, that it was the same as taking a gunshot to your spirit. So you should never ever look it up. And that people who spoke out against him and lied about him were being controlled by Satan, which is another control tactic classic to cults of demonizing the outgroup and having names to demean them. They called them weeds. But I remember one time before I fully knew that reality, or they were keeping a lot from me, that I looked at the person who was managing me, actually. I looked at a piece of her mail, and it had a name that was not her name. The first and last name were different. Because turns out if you're in JMS long enough, he'll give you a new name, which again, totally, that's what Heaven's Gate did. That's what all cults do. Like, they give them new names so that you leave your old identity and only identify with your cult identity. It's like trying to separate you from yourself as much as possible. And also, her last name was not the same, but it matched the cult leaders. And I knew that she was a faith star. So I was like, she changed her name to match Jung's? That's what married people do. I thought this was just like a spiritual nun kind of thing. And it freaked me out. And then also there was a time where one of the roommates who had been in it for decades, I overheard her talking about this pastor named Pastor Kyla, who was super high up in the church. And I remember her saying, oh, I'm going to get her some Victoria's Secret underwear for her birthday. And I remember being like, why would, a faith star and then this super holy pastor ever need Victoria's Secret underwear? Like, I could not understand, and now I know why, but at the time it freaked me out. But I put those things on my shelf and figured I'd get an answer for them later. Because that's another thing JMS taught. Oh, if you're confused about something, just hang on, you'll get an answer later, it's fine. So there was also a time where I was struggling because I was missing pre-dawn services, and there was this leadership meeting where they basically were like, some of us aren't waking up for pre-dawn, and that is messing up the spiritual condition of the church. And that's ruining the spiritual condition of the church. We're not setting the condition. So the church is never going to grow because of that. And I was the only one who wasn't attending pre-dawn. So it was pretty clearly a public call out to me without saying my name. And it's like, I was so exhausted. How am I supposed to do this? It makes no sense. So I pulled that leader aside later in a different Zoom call, because again, COVID. And I was like, hey, I'm trying. I have ADHD and my degree is so hard in itself, but having to do everything online is just unbearable. And I'm really struggling, so I'm sorry. And she basically was like, oh, Jung said you can change that if you pray. Like, praying can literally change your DNA. He said that in this service or whatever and showed me, and I was like, oh my God, this church claimed to be pro-science, but it's clearly not. That is ridiculous. Another moment was when there was this guy who had been in the church for decades, left, and my roommates were talking about why he left, and they said his argument was that a loving God would never create hell in the first place because a finite sin should never equate to an infinite punishment. And they were like, oh, he's overthinking it. He doesn't understand God and all this stuff or how it works. And I remember sitting there thinking, actually, that's a really good point. I think I agree. There was also a time where we had this Bible study online, and there was this woman who was in it, and they were trying to recruit. And she basically asked the question, because it was relevant to the lesson, why does God in the Bible condone slavery? And she explained that this question was really important to her for her to be a Christian because she was a black woman and had slaves in her ancestry, which is a super valid concern to have and something you deserve to have answered. And then afterwards, they were like, oh, she just came in wanting to pick a fight, but she wasn't actually there to fully hear and really listen to God. And I remember being like, why are we demonizing her for asking a question? This church claims to be all about questions, but it seems like you can only ask certain questions and only get answers from their pre-approved list of answers. And why are we demonizing this person for asking a good question that means a lot to them? Like, why are it was just such an us versus them reaction. Another moment was when my mom was going through a really bad health issue, so they said, oh, you should write a letter to Jung. Like, a lot of people in the church write letters to Jung. If you're lucky, like, you may get a response once in your life. It's like a huge deal if you get a response. 99.9% of the time you don't. But he says he'd read it, though. So I was like, yeah, sure, I should do that. So I wrote a letter. It's very simple. It was just like, thank you for all that you do. Please pray for my mom. She's going through this, blah, blah, blah. So my roommate, who was like in her 50s and had been in the group for decades, was like, oh, can I read it? And I was like, yeah, sure, you can read my letter. And then, so she read it and she goes, oh, it's not romantic enough. And I was stunned. She was like, yeah, it's not romantic enough. You should love him more romantically. And then she cut out a cardboard cutout of a heart and stuck it to my monitor with tape and was like, every time you see that heart, you should pray to love him more romantically. And I was like, what the fuck are you saying to me? That's insane. Imagine saying that about Jesus. You wouldn't! Because that's a bananas thing to do. But that was decades of indoctrination slipping through like the mask was off. Because she thought, if I'm going down the path to be a faith star, then I should love him romantically. And they were letting me in on that a little bit. Oh my god, it freaked me out so bad. Another key moment, and this is actually one of the most important ones, was when I finally watched the movie Pixar's Soul. It's a movie about a music teacher named Joe Gardner who goes on a journey to learn that there's not some grand purpose that people need to fulfill. The point of living is to be and to live and to experience, to be embodied and find what makes you light up inside and experience joy in the small everyday moments, and that's truly living. And it's one of the greatest movies of all time. It makes me sob. And that movie got the ball rolling for me where I was like, wait a minute. I don't think I've been alive for a long time. I think I've been numb for a very long time. And cults numb you intentionally. That way you don't hear the red flags coming from your nervous system about the organization, and you won't wish for more. They want you in autopilot because that's when you're easiest to control. And it hit me like a fucking truck that I was not living, and I hadn't been. And I tried to be like, oh, is it because I'm stressed from school or whatever? But slowly I realized it was because of JMS's teachings doing this to me. And this makes perfect sense that it impacted me so much. There's this book called It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. And she talks about how loving someone who's suffering from narcissistic abuse is like loving someone in a cult. And the best thing you can do for them is to talk to them about times they felt alive and remind them of what it felt like to feel alive. Hey, remember that time we went to the lake and we jumped in the water and blah, 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 and talk about happy memories? And that can be super effective for helping them wake up from that. The final straw came when I saw a video about cults, and it was about the Moonies, which actually JMS branched off of. And it mentioned mass weddings, and it said, mass weddings claim thousands of every year. And again, they hid the mass wedding thing from me for a long time, but that's like right after I learned about it, and I was like, oh shit, claim is a scary word. We do that too. So then I looked up the bite model, and it was game over. And I went through it with actually the person who's now my partner, but wasn't at the time. I told him I thought my church might be abusive, so he made me go through the bite model. And at first it was very scary and felt horrible, but I slowly realized, like, oh my gosh, JMS fits 96% of the bite model. It's a model that outlines all these control tactics that cults use on people, and JMS did every single one almost, with the exception of, like, physically hurting somebody. But then I learned later through a documentary about JMS on Netflix that they were physically hurting some people in Korea, but whatever. So that's when I finally knew I've got to get out of here. But there was an issue. I was living in the church building, hours away. My parents had just divorced and sold their house, so neither of them really had a home. So I literally had nowhere to go. I was kind of homeless because my current place was a cult church that was making me feel like I was dying and was very unsafe for me. And I had nowhere to go because I couldn't get a job and get an apartment in that city because I needed to get out of that city. I couldn't stay there with that cult there. So for months, while I figured it out, I had to pretend I wasn't doubting. I went to services and pretended, and let me tell you, psychological torture. It was physically so painful. So I basically prepared my escape by getting rid of as much stuff as I could, like just donating cards of my stuff so that I could get out of there quickly. Thank goodness my mom got a boyfriend who had an extra room at the time I could stay in. So eventually I was able to pack up all my stuff and leave in one movement. And I basically just lied and said, oh, I'm going to start attending the church because I got this job here. And I went through all the steps of getting transferred to the church. And I moved and got out of there. And then just eventually sent them a text. I was like, hey, never speak to me again. I'm leaving this church. Goodbye. This is a chapter of my life I'm closing the door on. Everybody better leave me the fuck alone. And I blocked them on everything humanly possible, in every way possible. Phone numbers, any socials, the messaging apps they used, everything. Editing me here, chiming in. I realized that I forgot a funny story about leaving, where my last night in the church building, since, I knew I was leaving the church and moving out, I went and bought some wine. I had never had alcohol really before. And I snuck it into the church building, and I got really wine drunk in my room, and some of them even came and talked to me and couldn't tell. And like, they considered that a huge sin, like drinking. So I think that is so funny. I'll try to include some photos. And I went and moved in with my mom and her boyfriend. Right after I decided to leave, I did secretly have, like, online friends because it was, like, the only way JMS could know I had friends. And I got invited to one of their weddings. That happened to be, like, literally the weekend after I decided I gotta leave. Like, the bite model. Like, I just gotta get out of here. This is actually a cult. Good and bad things happen randomly, not because of some god. And that was confirmation for me. To say I was at rock bottom after leaving is putting it lightly. I've talked about this before. It was like God himself put me on the bus from Bikini Bottom to rock bottom, and I was stuck talking like for the rest of my life. It's hard to put into words how much I feel like I lost at this time, and I had to mourn this for years. I lost all of my psychological anchors, my belief system, and my entire identity, because my partner's actually an atheist, but at the time he was like, you can still be religious, you can leave JMS and still be religious if that's what you want. But I was like, if this isn't true, I don't think any of it's true. Because the critical thinking tools I had developed to get me out of JMS then just immediately worked on all religion too. And I was like, fuck, I can't believe any of this. Like, I just can't. So I lost my entire identity. I lost a ton of my possessions because I had gotten rid of them to make the move easier. I had a hedgehog at the time who was such a comfort to me, but she died. Just pure coincidence on that timing. I didn't have a job and couldn't find one. My degree had become useless because I gave all my time to JMS, so I didn't get any relevant experience or connections while I was at college. I didn't have my family because it had just broken up and they were all too worried about their own issues to care about mine. I lost all my old friends because I had distanced myself from them like JMS told me to, and I regret that so much, and I wish I could apologize, and I treated them so bad. But I also have to simultaneously hold that I'm a victim of manipulation and abuse, but also made bad decisions and hurt people. And both of those things can be true. I lost my enmeshed community that I had within JMS that was super tight because they all shun you as soon as you leave, and obviously I wouldn't want to be around them anyways. I was so poor that I was overdrafting my bank account just trying to buy food and had to call the bank and beg them to take the fees off. By the way, they won't. And the boyfriend I had broken up with for JMS, we never fully stopped talking. He was willing to give me another chance after all that, so we started dating again, but then he dumped me because he decided that the cult thing was too much for him. I had an eating disorder. My body was failing as a consequence of how much I had pushed myself within JMS. The stress of it all caused me to not be able to tolerate gluten anymore. So I developed a gluten intolerance that made me violently ill anytime I have anything with gluten in it. And let me tell you, that's everything. I truly had nothing. Except the person who is now my current partner. He was the only person who stuck with me through it all. When I told him about it, learned all about cults to try to support me as much as possible, and was with me every step of the way. He is truly the best person I know. So that's when I had to begin the first steps of trying to heal and rebuild life, and I began to immediately struggle greatly. I didn't have the words for it at the time because I didn't even know what it was, but nihilism was kicking my ass. I felt so aimless and hopeless and truly felt like life was just a time bomb of suffering. Every moment was just a countdown to the next event that would make you suffer tremendously, and there was nothing good, and that it was all meaningless. And I finally learned, what nihilism is after watching one of the greatest movies of all time, Everything Everywhere All at Once. It also taught me about optimistic nihilism. And I tried to lean into that. And while it's easy for some people, optimistic nihilism, though, never came easily to me and still does not. No matter how much I try, I just can't. And back then I had no coping skills, so there just wasn't helping. For me, nihilism, as I've worked through in therapy, was a bit of a trauma response because I had been taught that if I left, horrible things would happen to me. And religion was my security blanket my entire life for tragedy, but I suddenly had it ripped away with no tools in its place. And my nervous system was like, okay, we gotta be hypervigilant to the negative things and the meaninglessness and the bad things to keep us safe. Every day was just a horrible struggle. And I just want to remind you that, you don't choose what you believe. That's why a lot of you are atheists right now. And I'm sure a lot of you understand as atheists, you don't choose it. You just are not convinced. And I was not convinced by optimistic nihilism. So, I really just there's this militant belief within a lot of atheists that, oh, optimistic nihilism is only good. Nihilism is only a good thing. It's freeing, it's awesome, blah, blah, blah. There are some of us that do not thrive in that space. So I just ask you to have empathy for all types of atheists. So, while I was struggling with this nihilism, I had this really horrible life event happen where I watched a family member die. It was horrible. I was there when she passed. And that was just the final straw for my nervous system. And it kicked off very severe CPTSD. If you don't know what CPTSD is, it's a form of PTSD that comes from being locked in chronic stress, like low-grade stress, instead of one huge event. So for years, I was locked in a heightened anxiety fight or flight state, and when that happens, your body forgets how to turn it off. So I was so anxious all the time. It was 1,000 times worse than any anxiety I'd ever experienced before. I had horrible chest pain almost all the time, even just sitting and working. My doctor thought that there was something wrong with my heart because of how it was racing all the time. I had a bunch of heart tests done. Any slight, loud sound, sudden movement, any hearing of any slightly bad news, even if it was not related to me or anyone I knew, would kick me into an absolute meltdown. And I wouldn't figure this out until later, but I had also developed OCD with a theme in medical OCD and existential. I was so fixated obsessively on suffering, and I thought every little sensation in my body was me dying, because my body was hypervigilant, assuming that I was going to die and needed to be on high alert for every threat. I had constant intrusive thoughts of my family members and loved ones dying horribly, like a constant movie playing in my head so vividly that it was inescapable. I cried all the time, and there's this thing called somatization where, the chronic fight or flight causes inflammation in your body, so I just had chronic pain all the time. And I believed so sincerely that life was more suffering than it's worth. And I was having constant suicidal ideation. But because the theme of my OCD was the fixation on suffering, it kept me from ever acting on those thoughts because that would inflict the very thing I fear most on my loved ones. If you had given me the option to never exist in the first place so that no one would suffer from losing me, I would have taken that immediately with no hesitation. I wished I could not exist constantly. And finally, it got so bad, I confided in my current partner about these struggles, and we were long distance at the time. So I told him about what I was going through, and he encouraged me to go to therapy. I decided I couldn't live this way. It was totally unbearable, so I finally went. I just so happened to find someone who specializes in cult trauma in my area. It's a bit of a drive. I found a cult trauma-informed specialized therapist. Therapy was really hard and exhausting, but if you take anything away from this video, it's that religious trauma really needs a somatic trauma-informed based therapy. Like, talk therapy is not going to do enough. There are different modalities that work for different people, but talk therapy will have little success with religious trauma because its whole thing is disconnecting you from your body. So if you are someone who's suffering with religious trauma, I really encourage you to find a trauma-informed, somatic-based therapist. So for me, that looked like doing a hybrid of EMDR, which is where you process traumatic memories to help your brain know that it's not a current threat, it's in the past, and IFS, which is basically a form of therapy where you heal the parts of yourself that formed in order for you to survive, and for you to take the steering wheel of yourself again, instead of being ruled by trauma responses. And it was very slow progress, but after about a year, I finally began to feel some progress. It was still hard, but at least my nervous system was starting to learn how to regulate again. And as the CPTSD began to get better and heal, there were still some things that felt treatment resistant, and that's what we learned were OCD, and we adjusted our approach to those things. And it's one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I slowly developed the skills and tools to heal. So I got in touch with my true self, I would say again, but really for the first time, because a lifetime of religion had been separating me from it, as we discussed. It started when I was like 4. I learned that my instincts and my inner wisdom are good and can be trusted. The shame that was given to me was never mine. I could give it back to the church. I could give it back to my parents. I don't have to accept it. You can give it back. I contain a multitude of parts that have wisdom and skills for me to learn from, even if I don't let them take the steering wheel from me all the time and I keep my capital S self at the steering wheel. They're welcome to be here. My body and my nervous system do know what they need. And emotions are morally neutral and are signals that serve a biological purpose. And there is wisdom you can get from them if you have a healthy relationship with them, which is something religion never lets you have. My emotions are welcome to exist within me and be heard. And these realizations were making me truly feel alive for the first time. Zelf on the Shelf is a YouTube channel about religious deconstruction that's really good. Tanner explained on that channel one time that after leaving, he realized his whole life that he had been clenching, and that's basically what I experienced too. So at the same time, while I was suffering these intense lows that were suddenly so intense because it was like someone turned the lights on for the first time and it's painful, I was also experiencing highs and the good parts of life with more vividness than I ever had before. But I only began to feel somewhat normal, where there were more good days than bad, after about 2 years of healing and making an effort. One of the most helpful books to ever have blessed my brain for me, and it won't be for everybody's different, but it's a book called Radical Acceptance. And it was one of the first things along with therapy that made me feel like I could actually get through this. I highly recommend that book, and I'll probably talk about it in detail in the future. But even with, starting to feel normal, there were still these final steps that I needed to take. Nihilism was still kicking my butt. I could never return to religion because that would be disingenuous to myself, and I couldn't make myself believe that crap. Sorry, that was mean. But not having any framework or any meaning in life was eating me alive. Because again, some people can exist in nihilism, and that's so great, but a lot of us cannot, or don't naturally do well with it. You don't choose what you believe. And my nervous system was not buying optimistic nihilism. So I was still fixated and constantly obsessed with the knowledge of all this meaningless suffering. And I still wasn't sure that life was even worth it. The reality is, I need both my inner wisdom and skepticism and an authentic spirituality that's true to me to help me get through the world. I needed to bring in both. And in that truth is the key to your journey out of destructive forms of nihilism. You can find secular, atheistic frameworks and spiritualities that your nervous system will feel comfortable in and feel authentic to you. It'll take some experimentation and some searching, but I promise there's something out there and everybody's different. So after my therapist had a come to Jesus moment with me where she was like, nihilism doesn't seem to be like serving you, it seems to only be hurting you. So I began the exploration of finding what frameworks work for me. And there's a lot out there that felt horrible and I just could not buy. Like anything with woo, I really struggled with. So I listened to my inner wisdom and slowly found things that helped me. And I'm going to talk about all of them more in detail in the future later because I think they're so helpful to those struggling with atheism and nihilism without betraying yourself and trying to convince you of something you don't authentically believe. So for me, Jungian psychology offered me a lot. It gave me a framework for understanding myself and how to heal and grow spiritually, and just a touch of woo while also being able to keep it secular and atheistic. I also learned how to achieve awe and transcendence and connection through something greater through Carl Sagan books. Because he teaches that science can be spirituality, and I totally believe that. Because the only times I really felt connected to something bigger, truly, was when I was getting my genetics degree and was learning about evolution and human history. So through Carl Sagan books, I was able to hone in getting that sense of awe that is important for humans while still being completely atheist. And finally, secular Buddhism has really helped me cope with like suffering and death through a secular lens. I'm going to make tons of videos about all these in the future for atheist spirituality, but if you have any questions to get the ball rolling, go ahead and drop them down below. And with these like frameworks, I've been able to build a life that while it comes with its struggles, I wouldn't trade for the world. Like I would go through everything the exact same again because I like who I am and how my brain is and my beliefs and the richness of my life experience now in ways I don't think I would have been able to do without hitting that rock bottom and having my entire world shook out of religion. And that's like basically my story so far, all the way from 4 years old to 27. And thank goodness it is a story that eventually reaches a point of healing and joy, even though it felt impossible for many points of it. And I have a pretty okay job. I live with a partner who I love more than anything. We have a beautiful home where we're always happy and safe, and we've decorated it so cute. It's nice to feel like I have a home again after so long of not. I have all these hobbies that bring me so much joy, like this YouTube channel, crochet, gardening, houseplants, embroidery. Like I have so much fun with my hobbies that I would never have picked up if I hadn't left religion and learned to chase the things that bring me joy and make me feel connected. If you're dealing with religious or cult trauma, I promise you there is a way out of it, and you can find happiness again even from the darkest places. So thanks for listening and hearing all this. It's a long story, but I hope you gained something from hearing it, whether it's just feeling less alone or you learned something about deconstruction or abusive religions. If you have any questions about any part of the story, from the 4-year-old me to the teenage me to the college me to now, I would love to deep dive into anything you guys are wondering about. So I'm going to read you a couple quotes that I think are the perfect end cap to this story. The first one's by Carl Sagan. If you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. Spirituality for me has been just like Soul, Pixar's Soul, like discovering that the universe is magic because you get to experience it. Like I've talked about previously, because I'm able to be embodied and live in my body and understand that reality is insanely awesome and magic. Like I had a spiritual experience from just eating a lemon and being like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that billions of years of this universe, all this evolution for the lemon trees and humans all came together so that I could experience the taste of a lemon that's unlike anything. Like, how do you explain tasting a lemon, dude? It's awesome. The simple everyday things and the grandeur of the universe are inseparable. They're the same thing. And also, I want to read you this that I've read before, but I just think it's perfect. The truth? There isn't any. All we've managed to find out about the boundaries of the universe is that it hasn't got any. And all we know about God is that we don't know anything. So the only thing a mom who is a priest demanded of her family was simple. That we do our best. We plant an apple tree today, even if we know the world is going to be destroyed tomorrow. We save those we can. Frederick Brackman, Anxious People.